Hello, everybody. Maps change. They may not change physically, but they change in our mind. When we look, for example, at a map of the United States these days, I think it's a very different kind of image with Canada on one side and Mexico on the other that we used to imagine when we looked at maps of the United States. Much less global, much more enclosed. And Donald Trump himself seems to be influenced by maps. There was a recent piece on the BBC about why an Oval Office map has played a crucial role in his view of the Ukraine war. The map is of some of the territories in the east of Ukraine occupied by Putin's forces. And Trump has apparently said to Fox News, I assume you've all seen the map. I don't quite know what that means. We never quite know what Trump means, but certainly maps are influential in his head too. It's a complicated head, and there's a new book out on maps. Actually, it's a slightly old book that now is being published in paperback in the US and the UK. It's called A Brief History of the World in 47 Borders, maybe not quite maps, but we wouldn't have borders without maps. It's written by my guest, John Elledge, who is joining us from Bethnal Green in East London. John, congratulations on the book. It's been a huge hit. Wonderful idea, A Brief History of the World in 47 Borders. You wrote it, I think, before you could have included Donald Trump's Oval Office map of Ukraine in the book. But I'm guessing that story somehow conforms with the spirit of the book. Is that fair?
That's very fair, yes. I've been thinking a lot about that ancient Chinese curse, which isn't an ancient Chinese curse at all. It's actually just an English phrase, but may you live in interesting times. And I feel like the sort of authorial version of that is like, may your book about geopolitics prove to be unnervingly relevant. And since I wrote this book about 2-3 years ago, I finished it now. A lot of the stories in it have only come to become more and more relevant and taken up more of the news. So obviously I talk about Ukraine, I talk about the Middle East, but also there's an essay in the book on the US's northern border, which I didn't think in a million years was going to suddenly be dominating the headlines for several months earlier this year, when Donald Trump was arguing that it was an artificial border and Canada wasn't a real country. So yeah, I would say that inadvertently, though somehow pleasingly, the book has proved to be very, very 2025, put it that way.
Very, very 25 and very 2025, John, which is why you're on the show. 25 years ago, I remember, I'm old enough to remember, that we were promised that we would get rid of borders. There was all the promise of globalization, the internet, digital networks, the old borders, the old physical apparatus of traditional society would be done away with. Was that just idealism? How do you make sense of the way in which borders have suddenly become the hottest issue of the first quarter of the 21st century? You have it, of course, in the UK with Nigel Farage, who has fetishized the borders of the UK in the same way as Trump has fetishized the borders of the US.
I do feel like, yes, there was a particular moment of globalization and kind of liberal hegemony that's kind of been on the wane since 2016, put it that way.
To put it mildly, I think.
Yes.
We could use stronger words than wane, John, couldn't we?
Yeah, collapsing around. I mean, like, but I don't know where you come from politically. I personally think that's quite a bad thing. I grew up on a diet of kind of science fiction, like Star Trek and so on, and kind of imagining that like we were going to move towards like one kind of planet politically, and that organizations like the European Union is the most obvious, were kind of a step towards that and a step towards solving global problems with global institutions. I no longer feel like that is the path we are on. That was very much brought home here in the UK in June of 2016 with the Brexit referendum, and then obviously Donald Trump was elected president for the first time just over 4 months later, and it does kind of feel like nationalism is back in a big way. Obviously, writing the book, I thought a lot about why that might be. I do think, to a certain extent, it's because some kind of territorial division is sort of inevitable. Like, you kind of, on a fundamental level, you need to know who you're paying tax to and whose laws you're obeying. So, like, you kind of do need some kind of physical demarcation of the planet for modern politics to work at all. And maybe those kind of forces pushing us together were functions of a benign economic environment. And, we're still, to a large extent, dealing with the aftershocks from the crash, aren't we? And maybe just at a time when, like, the pie isn't growing at the rate that it once was, certainly in the developed world anyway, it is much harder to kind of make a sort of generous take a generous approach to kind of distribution of resources and issues like migration as well. So, like, because I think with the kind of rise of, how do I put it, the rise of sort of a more sort of ethnically tinged nationalism in a lot of
crowd, the Farages and the Trumps of the world.
Yeah, like those guys. I do think to some extent it is downstream of the fact that we're just not getting richer at the rate we once were.
Yeah, I mean, you said earlier, John, you said, I don't know what your politics are, but mine are on the left, progressive, so I was always a globalizer. But I'm not sure it's quite as simple as that, because, of course, 25 or 50 years ago, the globalizers were also in Wall Street and in the City of London. They believed in getting rid of borders to expand global capitalism. So does it break down as neatly politically as perhaps some people might like to think? People in favor of borders are the Trumps and the Farages, the bad guys of the world, and the rest of us want to do away with borders. One can be a progressive, can't one, John, and still believe in borders? In fact, in some ways, a progressivism can be rooted in the idea of a border.
Well, I mean, I think certainly, I mean, yes, obviously that was an oversimplification. I'm a journalist. I do a lot of those. But yeah, I do think, like, firstly, there were people on the left who voted for Britain to leave the European Union, for example. There was a group called Lexiters, meaning left-wing Brexit, who saw the European Union very much in the kind of terms you just described, and who didn't see it as kind of like, the free movement of people, but as the free movement of capital, as the kind of body that had been screwing over poor people in Greece during the Eurozone crisis. So yeah, there are definitely people on the left who would take a different approach. And also you can make an argument that, like, progressive politics in terms of, distribution of wealth does kind of require you to have a sense of, like, who is inside the country and who is not. All those things are true. But nonetheless, I would say it is reasonable to argue at this point in history that the people who are most enthusiastic about strengthening borders or territorial expansion do tend to be from the hard right rather than the left.
It's interesting you bring up the Brexit case, because, of course, on the one hand, there were people who believed in Brexit who were in favor of reiterating the UK's borders. They won out in the end. But the EU crowd also believe in borders. I mean, I'm not sure. I don't think you deal with this specifically in any of the chapters in your book. But this expansion of the borders of the EU is interesting in the way in which it's eaten up Eastern Europe, and the way in which it's created this border between Europe and particularly Africa, which is, and much of the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, places of great civil conflict, which is perhaps the major cause of the refugee crisis of the last 20 years. So even multinational states like the EU have borders, don't they?
Well, yes. I mean, the EU, you can certainly argue that one of the corollaries of weakening the borders between EU countries and kind of having free movement of, people, labour, capital, etc. One of the side effects of that is the EU needs to defend its external borders much more. You still need that kind of insider-outsider paradigm, and one of the side effects of Brexit has been to put the UK outside that club rather than, well, not really a side effect. That is literally the point of it. But I think a lot of the people who voted for Brexit were a little bit surprised to realise this means you are in a different queue at the airport. You have less rights in Europe as a British citizen than you did before. I would disagree with the suggestion that the expansion of the EU is in some way to blame for the refugee crisis. I think there are a lot of complicated reasons for that. One of which is going to be climate change. I think we're going to see a lot more of that as the century rolls on. Another, which frankly is probably the crash again. Like the economic impact of what happened in 2008 was a major factor in the what do we call it, the Arab Spring of 2011, which kind of destabilized a lot of the region's governments. That was a cause of the refugee crisis, and that was relating to the crash. So I'm not so convinced that EU expansion has any direct result there, but it does mean there is kind of like a common European response to a crisis, which Britain has put itself on the outside of by leaving the European Union.
You talked about the Middle East. I know, again, you wrote a book 2 or 3 years ago before the quote-unquote Hamas invasion of Israel, which wasn't really an invasion. It was a peculiar kind of border incident. And, of course, the Israeli response has been draconian, very dramatic.
Now who's using euphemisms?
Yeah, exactly. How would you... how does that narrative, both the initial Hamas action and then the Israeli response, how does it fit into your narrative about borders, particularly given the bizarre border of Gaza itself, which isn't even really the Palestinian state? Even in an ideal world, it's a sliver of territory. So make sense of that one. I'm sure, again, were you writing the book today, you'd probably have a whole chapter on Gaza.
I mean, there is a chapter on the border of Israel. It was, if I'm honest with you, it's the last chapter I wrote. I tried to wriggle out of writing it, and my editor said, "No, you absolutely have to do Israel. You can't just sort of not do it and hope I don't notice." And it's
why did you want to do it?
Because I mean, like, to give listeners and viewers kind of a sense of the book. It's generally quite a sort of light-hearted, but there's a lot of jokes in it about civil war between Charlemagne's grandchildren and so on. It's meant to be sort of informative and give you a lot of history and a lot of geography, but it's also a book about quirky stories of human stupidity, and obviously there are some big border stories I had to do which are not in any way funny. Like, it's very difficult finding jokes in, for example, the partition of India, and the Israel-Palestine situation is certainly at one end of that spectrum. It is, I think, the only chapter in the entire book which I don't think has a single joke in it. I ended up writing just a completely straight account of the history. I tried to be entirely even-handed and just say, like, so here are the things that kind of led to a large chunk of European Jewry getting interested in the creed called Zionism. Here are the reasons, like, so many European Jews ended up in this part of the world. Here is why the existing population was upset about it, and just kind of did a fairly straight run through the history. And I tried to end on a message of hope about, I found a group pushing for something slightly different from a two-state solution, but people drawn from both sides of that divide, arguing for some kind of like new, almost a sort of confederal relationship, more like something a bit like Belgium, oddly enough. And then between my writing that and the book being published, October the 7th, 2023 happened and the war began. And I'm not sure I would write that chapter the same now. I think it would have been much harder to, I would have struggled to be quite as even-handed as we're watching extremists on one side of Israeli politics essentially try and wipe out the people of Gaza. I don't think I would have been able to end on what I thought was some kind of find hope there.
Again, thinking about that, what's happened there in the last couple of years out loud in terms of your narrative or in terms of borders. On the one hand, there was that bizarre incident where Hamas cut through the border, or at least the barbed wire on the border of one of the most high-tech states in the world. There's always a suspicion that that border should have been more secure. And then, of course, there's the Israeli response, which is to sort of deny borders or deny territory and just flatten a whole country. So there are lots of rather tragic ironies there, aren't there?
I mean, the Israeli government is quite explicitly pushing for a policy that's known as Greater Israel, like basically like swallowing the remaining Palestinian territories. That is clearly not the position of everybody in Israel. A lot of Israelis want peace, want peaceful coexistence with the Palestinians, but it does seem to be the policy of the Netanyahu government, and especially the sort of more right-wing parts of his coalition. And it is, as with what we're seeing in Eastern Europe right now, it is essentially an attempt to move a border by force, which is slightly horrifying because that's the way borders worked for so much of history. Like where the line was between two territories would, to a large extent, be determined by who was the stronger economically or even more often militarily. Since 1945, we have largely left that world behind. It does kind of feel like perhaps we are moving back into that world, and I'm not sure that is a very good thing.
Yeah, I don't think many people would disagree. And of course, Donald Trump, who has been so influenced by the map of Ukraine on the White House wall, also is influenced in Gaza. I'm not sure if he has an equivalent map of Gaza on his wall. When it comes to the Middle East, one of the great divisions, or one of the great narratives, is the Sykes-Picot Agreement between a French and British diplomats who literally carved up the entire Middle East. You have a chapter on that in the book. Tell us about Sykes and Picot. I hope there are more jokes about that one, John, in the book.
I mean, there are some more jokes. I mean, again, it's quite a serious
one. Exactly funny either, is it?
No. But I mean, like that. So one of the things that, forgive me, it's a while since I've reread the chapter, but one of the things that stays with me about that story is we use Sykes-Picot as kind of not quite portmanteau. I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but it's the term we use for a line that wasn't actually the one they drew. Like they did draw a line through the sand of what is now the kind of the border between Syria to the north and Iraq to the south, as it is now, is the proverbial line through the sand. And people sort of tend to assume that was the line Sykes-Picot drew. And it actually wasn't. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was one of a number made at different points during World War I between the Entente powers about how to divide up the Ottoman Empire should it fall, as everyone expected it would. And that's the one that everyone remembers as going into effect, even though actually it wasn't. And this is something you see a number of times in the history of borders, like the Peace of Westphalia is another one that people remember as being like, the creation of the nation state, when it wasn't at all. It's just kind of a useful term to kind of collapse a much longer historical process into. Or the Mason-Dixon line is another of those where, like, the Mason-Dixon line is a tiny bit of the border between, I think, Pennsylvania and Maryland.
Yeah, 4 states: Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, and West Virginia.
Exactly, yes. Whereas, like, everybody now thinks it was the border between the Union states and the Confederate ones during the American Civil War. It wasn't at all. It's just somehow the earlier label gets attached. So that's kind of an interesting thing about Sykes-Picot. I think that the large part, a big reason we remember it as such is because that division did involve the British and the French betraying their Arab allies, basically. Like there are a bunch of people fighting the Ottomans in the Arab world who were under the impression that they were going to be given their own states to run afterwards, and Britain and France agreed between themselves that this was not going to happen. The reason that those Arab allies found that out is because the original Sykes-Picot Agreement was also made with Russia, which was still on the Allied side at that point. Once it had a revolution or two and dropped out of the war, the details of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were published in the official Russian communist newspaper, Pravda. So that's the kind of agreement everybody remembers, because that's the moment where the Arabs knew they had been betrayed. But nonetheless, that is not actually the border on the ground. We have a different line on the sand to the one.
Yeah, and part of the narrative, at least
drew.
I think part of the narrative from the Arab point of view, although one can't highly generalize about Arabs, is that there was a promise of independence if there had been an Arab revolt against the Ottomans, who were on the side of the Germans. And of course, while they made this promise, the perfidious Albion, the English, and of course the French, they were also dividing the old Ottoman territory up between the two of them, which is of course also the foundations of today's complicated, again to use a euphemism, situation in Israel and indeed elsewhere, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. First World War is particularly consequential, John, in terms of these maps. I mean, Sykes-Picot was particularly absurd in the way in which the Anglo-French carved up the old Ottoman Empire. But the same was true in Eastern Europe, wasn't it? Many of the states that came out of the old Habsburg Empire in the First World War were created by people like Sykes or Picot, Western diplomats. Yugoslavia, for example, this very unnatural country, comprising 6 different nationalities, many ethnicities and religions. So there's something peculiar about the First World War, is that it exploded the borders.
Yes, I mean, I think the First World War is it's such a key moment because it's sort of the beginning of modern history. It's when we move from one paradigm to another. So before then, like the sort of main territorial unit is empires, isn't it? Like nationalism has been on the rise as a force for a number of decades, and is often, oddly enough, at the time was seen as a relatively progressive force, because if you were a Polish nationalist, then you were fighting for your independence from the Russian, Prussian, or I'll start that again, Russian, German, or Austro-Hungarian empires. So, like, you know, nationalism was seen as kind of the progressive side of politics. But nonetheless, it's like the First World War is when kind of like a bunch of nation states come into being, and we kind of start thinking that is the natural territorial unit, when for much of world history, that's not actually been the case. We've had empires and cities, and except for a few, and the nations come much later. I do think the process in Eastern Europe is slightly different to what goes on in the Middle East, though, because it's not all kind of external. Like, you're right that some of the countries that emerge from it are kind of put together in the various
yeah, but there were losers and winners. I mean,
yeah.
The Hungarians, for example, were massive losers in...
Yeah, the Hungarians are still not over the Treaty of Trianon, in which they lose, I think, 2/3 of their territory.
Right, and the whole issue of Transylvania. Of course, the German question, which caused the Second World War, probably the First World War too, and then Poland. And also, all these changes in maps create orphan cities. The great orphan city that you write about wonderfully in the book is a city that was once known as Königsberg, which was the heart of the Enlightenment, famously associated with Kant, Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher of the Enlightenment. And now Kaliningrad in Western Russia, this sliver of territory, a peculiar kind of narrative, named after one of Stalin's most bloodiest henchmen. So tell us about Königsberg, Kaliningrad, and the ironies of history, and how cities, a city like Königsberg, which has this long history as a Hanseatic port on the Baltic Sea, suddenly becomes this enclave within the old Soviet Union and now Russia.
So, yes, once upon a time, we're going back about 900 years here, that part of the world was held by a group called the Prussians, the old Prussians, but those are not the people we know of as Prussians. Those are kind of a sort of pre-Christian tribe, and then a bunch of German-speaking crusaders arrive and displace them and clear the place out, basically, in, I think it's called the Northern Crusade, and found the city that becomes Königsberg, which is for many centuries kind of the easternmost outpost of the German-speaking world. And as you note, it does become, you know, a very big university city. It's a centre of the Enlightenment. And as late as 1940, well, certainly as late as 1914, Germany reaches all the way through what is now that kind of part of what was Prussia, and that kind of sort of Baltic bit of Europe, to what is now Kaliningrad. After World War I, rather, a chunk of that is given to Poland as the Polish corridor to give what was then an inland power access to the sea. So Königsberg becomes East Prussia, which is cut off from the body of Germany. That is a bit of a sort of a pain point in interwar Germany. That's the sort of thing that that the Nazis could use to get people very angry. And during in the negotiations after World War II, that is lost entirely to Germany. The German-speaking population is entirely evacuated. It's taken over by the Soviets and becomes the city of Kaliningrad, named after the chairman of the General Soviet, I think, Mikhail Kaliningrad.
Yeah, I think he was number 2 to Stalin. Certainly had a lot of blood on his hands.
Not a nice man, as you say. But so the thing I find interesting about the city's story is, like, twice it has been basically ethnically cleansed. The first time to become the easternmost outpost of Germany, and the second to become the westernmost outpost of the Soviet Union. It made sense as kind of a Soviet city that sort of merged people from all over that sort of massive union of like a dozen different territories. After the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, though, it's kind of left out there on its own, because like Belarus and the Baltic states are kind of cutting it off from Russia, of which it's still a part. So it's now kind of like Russia's window on the West. It's kind of a major Russian military base. It is widely assumed they probably have nuclear missiles based there. But it has this kind of odd culture that's not entirely Russian, partly because it drew people from all over the Soviet Union, but partly also because it has much better links with the West. It has much better, during the Soviet period, it got access to Western fashions and Western pop music first. So it is so I'm going to massively mispronounce it. Suwalki Gap is the kind of corridor divide. You can just see it on the map there. The very thin sliver of territory,
and it's just to the south of the Baltic states of
that is likely to be a flashpoint in any big conflict between Russia and NATO. That is likely to be a big flashpoint, because it is a line that divides 2 bits of NATO and 2 bits of Russia. So it's kind of an interesting place geopolitically today as well.
Yeah, it's a wonderful story, and of course you can't really talk about maps and the re-architecture of maps without a chapter on Berlin and the wall. How does Berlin and the division of Germany and particularly of Berlin after the Second World War fit into your brief history of the world? What does it say? How does it complement the section on Königsberg?
Well, so the thing that I use the Berlin, the first section of the book is the sort of pure historical stuff. That's maybe half the text, even though it's only one section of 3. And it's roughly chronological. And I end that section with the story about the division of Europe and the Berlin Wall. And I did that in large part because it's kind of a nice note to end that on. That, like, I was born in 1980. The Berlin Wall coming down is one of the first political events I remember. And I grew up thinking there were naturally 2 Germanys. There had always been 2 Germanys, just as there had always been a Czechoslovakia. There had always been a Soviet Union. And it kind of is something you sort of have to unlearn slightly to realize, no, this was only true for, the division of Germany was 3.5 decades old at the time I was born. The Berlin Wall was under 2 decades old. I think I'm right in saying the Berlin Wall is actually slightly younger than you are, Andrew. It had really not been around for very long.
Someone has to be younger than me, right?
Yes, but yeah, the point is, like, if you grow up with a line on a map, it is very easy to imagine that it is natural. And the idea that it was drawn by human beings, possibly only a few years before you were born, it kind of feels weird, but it's true. Like the nation of Bangladesh, I will not tell you how old I was before I realized the nation of Bangladesh is all of 9 years older than I am, which is really not very well. No, actually, I was going to say it's not very old at all. Sadly, that's no longer true. It's not. It's quite old for a person. It's not old at all for a nation. But if you grow up with something on a map, you just assume it's natural.
And I think the great writers, of course, are the ones who point out the absurdity of what we take for granted. A lot of the way you talk and your descriptions, it reminds me of the Argentine fabulist Borges, who had a particular interest, I think, in maps and the redrawing of maps and shifting continents. We come to Bolivia, which itself could have almost been an invention of Borges. I know you have a chapter on Bolivia, gets us away from Europe and Königsberg and Berlin. What's so curious about Bolivia in terms of borders. It's distinctive, of course, because looking at the map of Bolivia, for people just listening, it's a big country in Latin America without a border on the sea. But I know you have a particular take on that.
The reason Bolivia is interesting from a borders perspective is, despite that lack of a coast, which you just noted, it maintains a navy. And it's done this over a century. I think it's about a century and a half since it lost. Originally, it held territory which is called the Department of the Littoral.
Yeah, this could be a Borges story, couldn't it? The idea of a country without a coast having a navy. Although I think the Czechs had the same thing.
It's the Hungarians, I believe. There's certainly a country in Eastern Europe, which, again, it's actually a similar story in that, Hungary did once have a coast. It once extended as part of the Habsburg Empire. It once extended all the way down to Trieste on the border, on the edge of the Adriatic, which is now part of Italy. But it's a very similar story with Bolivia, which at some point in the late 19th century lost its coastal region in a war with Chile. Which seems terribly unfair on the part of Chile, because really Chile only has coast. Chile is all
that's
coast.
all it has. I mean, that's the problem with Chile, is it's got coast, and Bolivia has everything but coast. I was just in Chile at the beginning of the year. It's huge mountains to the east, and then a slither of coast all the way down half the continent.
It's about 100 miles wide at its widest point, isn't it? Which is nothing in global terms.
So Bolivia is the reverse. So I hope they had an admiral in charge. That would be perfect. That would be Borgesian, wouldn't it? If Bolivia was run by an admiral.
I don't know if it's ever actually been run by an admiral. I believe Hungary, in fact, was run by an admiral after World War I.
Yeah, Horthy, Admiral Horthy.
Yes, indeed.
Very Hungarian story, which is probably why Hungary and Bolivia could be included in a similar chapter in your type of book.
Indeed.
Although Hungarians would probably get all upset if they're grouped with the Bolivians.
But yes, Bolivia maintains its navy as almost as kind of a national pride thing. It still undertakes kind of naval exercises on Lake Titicaca, which is high up in the Andes, just so that, in the event it one day does reacquire the ability to break out into the sea, it will be ready.
Wasn't there that famous football war between, I think it was El Salvador and Honduras, over, again, another imaginary map, which you probably didn't make it into the book, maybe for the second volume.
It actually, oddly enough, there is a bit about the soccer war in my first book, which is called The Compendium of Not Quite Everything, which is also, there's no theme to it at all. It's just the contents of my brain. It's facts and lists and essays on all sorts of random things, the whole gamut of human knowledge. But there is a chapter in that called Some Stupid Wars, and another called Some Wars Which Are Not Particularly Stupid, but nonetheless have stupid names. And I honestly, at this juncture, I cannot remember which of those two
probably both,
the football war made it into. But I think it may have been the latter, because actually it was a proper war, but it was one that kind of happened to have, tensions had been building up for a long time, but the trigger was a football match.
Well, let's end where we began. We began with Trump and his map of Ukraine on the wall of the White House. Let's end in Detroit. I have to admit, I would never have guessed there'd be a section on Detroit, of all places, in terms of a book on maps. I can imagine Königsberg and Berlin and Bolivia and the Mason-Dixon and Sykes-Picot. But what's interesting about Detroit, John?
So I'm going to give you a glimpse behind the curtain. What the origins of the book were kind of like, I was looking for a topic that would enable me to write lots of essays about lots of things I find interesting, which include history and geography and human stupidity, but also for many years I edited a website for a British political magazine called The New Statesman, and the website in question was about urbanism and cities. And one of the things I learned doing that was that a certain degree of Detroit's problems as a city related to the fact that it had physically grown rather than in population terms. Its borders had grown too quickly for various reasons in the early 20th century. Like it kind of had, it was kind of, there was a way of, it could be forced to annex its own suburbs in referendums. And and the real estate companies that were kind of building the suburbs of Detroit were kind of like astroturf these referendums to get people to vote to suck in these suburbs, so that then the city had to pay to kind of build, power infrastructure or streetcar lines, thus making the land on which these property developers were building homes, making it more valuable and kind of making those homes easier to sell. So the city of Detroit, during its kind of boom years and kind of, the first couple of decades of the 20th century, was forced to grow incredibly quickly. Like it's something like tripled its size, physical size, in the space for about 20 years, which is insane, and was one of the things that kind of led the city to kind of begin the long slide into bankruptcy. And, there are a lot of other reasons for that, related to kind of the decline of the car industry, and also racial politics and the phenomenon of white flight. But nonetheless, like this is one of the sort of under discussed aspects of Detroit's problems now in the 21st century relate to the fact that 100 years ago it was forced to expand its borders far more quickly than it should have done. And I just thought, in a book which spends a lot of time on kind of like the origins of the nation state and the Great Wall of China and the borders of the Roman Empire and all the kind of the modern issues we've discussed, it was kind of nice to kind of chuck in some essays on different topics, like there's essays on time zones and the international date line and the borders of air traffic control areas and so on. And I just thought the borders of Detroit and how like where you draw the line around the city can have a direct impact on the fate of that city was also just a nice story to tell.
Now there you have it, from Berlin to Bolivia to Detroit to the Sykes-Picot. Wonderful conversation from John Elledge, A Brief History of the World in 47 Borders. Surprising stories behind the lines of our map. It's a not entirely serious book, but quite serious in many ways, especially when it comes to Israel. It's out in paperback. John, congratulations on the continued success of the book. For people who want to learn more about John, they can also subscribe to his Substack, the newsletter of Not Quite Everything, although as you can tell from John, he seems to know everything. Lovely to have you, John, and we'll talk again
Lovely
in
to
the
be
not
here.
too distant future. Are you working on another book?
I am. We've not announced it yet. I'm nearly halfway through, which is probably not far enough, but don't